Hey, this is Greg with Land & Sea DIY, and welcome to the next episode of the renovation of our 1977 Grady White Overnighter. In this episode, you'll see us work toward completion of the back bench seat, the custom bench seat that we're building. We'll go ahead and cover the bench with a layer of fiberglass and work the corners of the bench in. You'll see what I had to deal with the curves of the corners, and prep it for fairing in the next episode, and then we'll go ahead and put the final 3 layers of fiberglass on the top of the back of the boat there. So with that, let's get to it. So here I'm cutting the fiberglass to match the curve of the edge of the bench seat. Had to do it on both sides, and you'll see that the fiberglass bunches up on the curve when I press it up against the curve. And the way I dealt with that is to cut vertical cuts into the fabric and almost cut a wedge between each vertical piece, and then the fabric conformed to the curve of the seat. And the reason I'm putting a layer of fiberglass here is just to lock the bench into the seat back. So as you can see, I just work around the curve, and you can see the pieces drape over the top, and I'll leave that like that, and that way when I put I'll have 3 layers of fiberglass up on top there, and they'll lock in with those tabs essentially that drape over the top. And there's the finished product after applying the epoxy to the fiberglass. Here I'm prepping the removable seat. The center portion of the bench seat is removable, so I have access to the bilge. And I went ahead and prepped it with acetone, wiped it down, and I'll cover it with one layer of fiberglass, just like it did one layer on the bench corners. And here I'm just fitting the piece of fiberglass to the bench, and we'll go ahead and coat it in epoxy and roll it out with the fin roller, and you'll see the finished product shortly. Throughout this build, I've used a two-part epoxy. It's a 2-to-1 epoxy, and it's 2 parts epoxy or resin, 2 parts resin and 1 part hardener. And I typically use a medium speed hardener. In South Florida, it's just what I got used to working with, and it's given me enough time to work with. You need to be cautious of how much you mix. The more you mix, the more I believe it's called the exothermic reaction, and gets hot really quick and kicks off really quick. So you just got to get the right amount mixed. And throughout this whole process, I learned what I can handle and what I can't in terms of the amount that I mix. So I always coat the surface first in epoxy, and then lay the fabric down on top of it, and then pour the epoxy on top of the fabric and either roll it in or press it in with a brush like I'm doing here. And just coating the surface first allows a good amount of epoxy so that the fabric doesn't suck it up as soon as you set it. You start placing epoxy, it's already dampened on the bottom. So I don't know, that method has worked for me throughout the build. You always want to use a fin roller to push all the air bubbles out of the fabric, and when I roll with the fin roller, I'll usually try to push toward where the dry fabric is, so I'm pushing all of that extra epoxy toward the dry fabric. You can see here. And then once I get to the end, I'll just be pushing the epoxy off the edge of the bench with the fin roller. Also, the way I learned to deal with curves is you can see the curved edge on the front of the bench, and what I learned to do is I'll cut extra fabric, so I'll allow extra fabric to drape over the edge, and then when I'll dampen the fabric super wet with epoxy, and then just allow it to drape over the edge, and that extra fabric kind of gives it the weight to hang tight to the curve, and then I'll roll it, and usually 10 minutes or so later I'll come back and check it, and if I see it pulling away, I'll push it back down with the roller, and that just seemed to be a successful method for me when I was dealing with curved edges like that. Here I'm just wiping down this seat back and corner to the seat with acetone, clean it off, and getting it prepped to go ahead and place fabric on this corner. Again, dampen the surface, just brush on that epoxy or whatever resin you're using prior to placing the fabric so that fabric doesn't suck all the epoxy up that you place on top. I was able to use the other side's corner as a pattern for this corner, and thankfully both sides are equal, which is a good sign, I think. And this piece of glass, this piece of fabric fit perfect to this corner.
Okay, now that the epoxy is cured, and following day I went ahead and trimmed up all the overhanging edges. I actually kind of find this satisfying to trim up those edges and get the fabric tight to the edge of the whatever the subsurface is. In this case, with a lot of this boat, it's wood. So yeah, just use an oscillating saw and trim up the edges, and then give them a little bit of a sanding, and all is good to go. So that's why I always drape the fabric longer than over the edge, because if you try to cut it exact to the edge, it's never going to end up that way, because as you roll with the fin roller, or as you're applying epoxy, you're stretching the fabric, and that fabric's going to end up overhanging anyway. So you might as well intentionally overhang the fabric, and knowing that once everything's cured, you'll come back the next day and trim everything up and get a perfect edge. I have to say, this little sander that I'm using is probably one of my most used tools in this boat restoration. It's made by Festool. I'm not compensated by them in any way for talking about this sander, but I actually spent a lot of money on this sander. But it's just been super reliable. It's very powerful, and I like the small size because I can get into tight spaces, and it's just really been my go-to tool. That and the oscillating saw, those two have probably been used the most during this restoration. So I went ahead and prepped this piece for fairing. I knew I wouldn't get to the fairing for another few days, so I went and wiped it down with acetone, and going to go ahead and sand it, and that way it'll be ready for me when I'm ready to fair in the next few days. Same thing here. Gonna go ahead and prep each corner for fairing in the next few days. So here I need to go ahead and make a pattern and basically just pattern the contour here for this form that I'm going to build, which you hopefully have seen in the previous video. Maybe it was 2 videos ago, but where I built this form and then built the fiberglass piece that's going to fit underneath the bench seat here. So this is the beginnings of making that form, and basically just took a 1/2 inch piece of wood, maybe it's 1/4 inch, I don't remember, probably 1/2 inch, and placed it against the gunnel, and then just kind of traced a pattern along the wood, and that gave me the contour on the bottom. And then I found this tool, I don't know what it's called, honestly. Found it at Walmart, but decided I'd try to use it to basically capture the contour or the angle on the top there. Didn't work very well, it was too big, so I went ahead and did essentially the same thing on the top, where just taking a piece of wood and going up bit by bit, maybe 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and tracing that contour onto this piece of wood, which will be my pattern. And you'll see in the future how I use this pattern. So I've got the angle for each end based on how how you saw me trace it previously, and I go ahead and cut that pattern out and mark that angle on the finished piece. And I know the distance between the starboard and the port sides, so I'll go ahead and measure that distance and then use that same pattern for the port side and cut that angle. So here I'm fitting the piece, and pretty much a perfect fit. The angles were just right and pretty tight fit, which is what I was looking for. So go ahead and put it in place, and then we'll go ahead and start screwing on support pieces to basically keep the bottom and the top as one piece for the form. So when we lay the glass on it in the future, that piece will remain as one piece. And here I'm just going to cut out some strips of plywood, and I'll use this to fasten the bottom of the form to the top of the form for that piece that's below the bench seat. And now I'll go ahead and screw these pieces on, and that'll fasten the bottom piece to the top piece of the form, keep that same angle, and I'll have basically a solid form to lay the glass on top of, which again is in a previous video. I'll go ahead and toward the end here I'll give you the episode that you can see where we actually laid the glass and built that fiberglass piece that sits below the bench seat.
Alright, you made it to the end of the video. So you'll see that we installed the panel or fit the panel that I had fabricated in a previous video. I made that its own video where you had seen the issues that we had with separating the fiberglass from the formwork. But at least in this video you saw how I built the form and what the final piece finally looked like in place. So with that, hope you join us on our next video, and please subscribe, like, comment, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.